This saint's intestines are wrapped around a windlass. This one's hauling baby Jesus across a river. At least two of these lady saints appeared in Joan of Arc's visions. Whoa, now, what? Yeah, okay, you heard me. Listen up, and I'll tell you all about the wacky stories of these 14 holy helpers and the gruesome ways most of them met their end. I'd like to start by drawing your attention to this stunning altarpiece that's housed in the St. Lawrence Church in Nuremberg, Germany. Besides being a remarkable piece of artwork, this painting holds a deeper significance. It features each of the 14 holy helpers, along with the attributes or symbols that are tied to their stories. Their veneration as a group specifically started in the Rhineland in the 14th century during the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, probably one of Europe's darkest times to, be alive in. Take a closer look, and you'll see St. George with his iconic dragon, Eustace with stag antlers adorned with a cross, and St. Vitus accompanied by, of all things, a rooster. There's St. Christophorus carrying the child Jesus, St. Catherine holding her engagement ring, and St. Erasmus, whose story involves his entrails being wound on a windlass. Further along, we see St. Denis with his own decapitated head, something you'll notice is a recurring theme in this video. There's also St. Nicholas with 3 golden balls, St. Barbara holding a chalice, and St. Margaret with a book and a sneaky little dragon perched behind her shoulder. There's also Blasius with a candle, and St. Giles, who's often depicted with a doe, a female deer, by his side, just to name a few. Before we begin though, there are a few things to keep in mind. In the first part of this small series, I'm only going to talk about 4 of them. Otherwise, I feel like the video will be too long, and I guess it would be better if I could explore the other saints in other following videos. Second, the stories of saints are often a blend of history and legend. Of the 14 holy helpers, about half were real historical figures whose lives and deeds were recorded, albeit heavily embellished over time, while the other half exist primarily in myth. Perhaps I should also briefly clarify what a saint exactly is, although I have a feeling most of you get the gist. In Christian tradition, a saint is someone recognized for their extraordinary holiness, virtue, or devotion. In Catholic and Orthodox tradition, saints are venerated as holy figures who are believed to intercede with God on behalf of the faithful. It's important to note that saints are not believed to have power of their own, but only through the grace of God. Saints are not worshipped per se, but they are respected and revered, just like their icons and relics, which are whatever they leave behind or have interacted with. In Catholic tradition, saints are sometimes chosen as patron saints, advocates for specific causes, professions, or struggles. This could happen through popular custom or official recognition by the church. Without further ado though, let's get into who some of these saints are, starting with probably the most badass of them all. St. George was an early Christian martyr who lived in the 4th century. Born in what is now Turkey, George joined the Roman army and rose to the position of a member of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Diocletian. This emperor was responsible for the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, the appropriately named Diocletianic or Great Persecution. St. George's refusal to renounce his Christian faith led to his arrest and his end. One of the most well-known stories of St. George is his legendary battle with a dragon. The tale goes that a dragon terrorized the village, demanding tribute from the locals. When their livestock and other offerings ran out, the villagers began to sacrifice a human each day. One day, a princess was chosen as the next offering. As she walked towards the dragon's cave, St. George saw her and asked why she was crying. She explained the situation and warned him to flee, fearing that he might be killed too. But George refused to back down. He confronted the dragon, slaying it, and saved the princess and the village. The story became central to his legacy, with a dragon in Christian art often symbolizing evil, sin, or the devil himself. In Christian art, St. George is also most commonly depicted on horseback wielding a spear. George has, according to legends and stories, made various appearances during several moments in history, long after his death, such as at the Battle of Antioch in 1098 during the Second Crusade. Soldiers apparently saw St. George leading an army on white horses, confusing the enemy and forcing them to flee. George was also said to have assisted with the siege of Jerusalem the following year while holding a banner with a red cross on it. And again in 1191, almost 100 years later, he appeared once more fighting beside Richard the Lionheart, who beat a significantly larger army led by Salahuddin during the Battle of Arsuf. He was henceforth seen as the king's protector, and his image shifted from that of a martyr to a chivalrous hero. Stories and legends about St. George were also told during World War I. Like during the Battle of Mons in August 1914, as British soldiers were forced into retreat, many claimed to witness a miraculous sight. A shining figure astride a white horse, wielding a sword of light, believed by some to be none other than St. George himself. Accompanied by a host of spectral bowmen, these apparitions were set to strike down German forces, giving the retreating British a momentary reprieve. These stories, most likely born from desperation, paranoia, and the spread of rumors among the men, quickly took on a life of their own. Some soldiers, gripped by exhaustion and fear, began to speak of visions of divine intervention. The accounts of St. George and his phantom warriors were not only shared among soldiers, but also found their way into magazines such as The Evening News, where Arthur Machen's fictional story, The Bowman, sparked widespread belief. What began as a tale of faith and myth became a symbol of hope amid the chaos of war. And it is fitting that such a story would revolve around St. George, who at this point was long seen as a military saint. That made him the perfect figure to embody these soldiers' desperate yearning for divine aid. Saint Barbara, known as the Great Martyr in the Eastern Orthodox Church, is another revered saint, though much of her story is shrouded in myth rather than solid historical documentation. Born to a wealthy pagan father, as the story goes, she is said to have lived in either Heliopolis or Nicomedia in the early 3rd century. Her father was determined to keep her isolated from the world and locked her away in a tower, believing it would protect her from outside influences, sort of like a modern-day Rapunzel. It also goes to explain why a tower is so often depicted alongside her in Christian art. Despite this confinement, Barbara secretly embraced Christianity, and when her father arranged a marriage for her, she refused. That defiance led her to make a rather bold but curious decision. She had 3 windows built into her private bathhouse, symbolizing the Holy Trinity, an act that enraged her father, who had originally planned for only 2 windows. When he returned from his travels, Barbara declared her Christianity openly. Her father, furious, brought her before the local prefect, who ordered her to be tortured. But despite the cruelty, Barbara held firm to her faith. Miracles occurred during this time, like the prison lighting up in the dark of night, or her wounds miraculously healing every morning, and torches meant to burn her would extinguish when they were brought near her. Ultimately, Barbara was sentenced to death by the removal of her head, and her father, in a messed up turn of fate, was the one to carry out the execution. Afterwards, though, as he returned home upon completing the deed, he was struck by lightning, and his body was consumed by flames. Saint Barbara's connection to lightning and fire led to her being invoked for protection against these dangers, and she became the patron saint of artillerymen and miners, professions that often dealt with explosions. Saint Catherine of Alexandria is another one of our saints that are considered to be more legend rather than historical fact, and it is argued that she was based on another Christian saint named Dorothea of Alexandria. Looking past that, though, the story of Catherine goes like this. Born to a wealthy family in Alexandria, her father was said to be the governor during the reign of Emperor Maximian. From an early age, Catherine was known as a rather studious and intelligent young lady. According to the legend, a vision of the Virgin Mary and the child Christ inspired her conversion to Christianity. When the next emperor, Maxentius, began persecuting Christians, Catherine boldly confronted him, condemning his actions. In response, he summoned 50 pagan philosophers to debate her, hoping they could discredit her faith. Instead, Catherine's eloquence and conviction were so powerful that several of her opponents converted to Christianity, an act that cost them their lives. Maxentius, frustrated by her defiance, hath Catherine imprisoned and subjected to brutal tortures. Yet the accounts say she was miraculously sustained, and that she was fed by a dove and comforted by visions of Christ. Even in confinement, Catherine's influence continued to spread, converting over 200 visitors to Christianity. including, reportedly, the emperor's wife. When neither torture nor persuasion could sway her, Maxentius proposed marriage, as pictured by the ring Catherine shows in the altarpiece I mentioned in the beginning of the video. Catherine refused, declaring herself spiritually wedded to Christ alone. Enraged, the emperor ordered her execution on a spiked breaking wheel, but as the story goes, the wheel shattered at her touch. Finally, she was condemned to the loss of her head, and after that was done, it's said that a milk-like substance flowed from her neck instead of blood, considered a symbol of purity. The spiked wheel that appears in her story is therefore also known as a Catherine wheel. Another curious fact about Catherine of Alexandria, and one of my favorite bits of trivia personally, is that Joan of Arc herself claimed that Catherine was one of the saints that appeared and guided her in her visions alongside Saint Margaret of Antioch, who we will be discussing next. Margaret of Antioch's story takes place during the early 4th century in what is now modern-day Turkey, amid the brutal aforementioned Diocletianic persecution of Christians. She was born to a pagan priest named Adasius. Her early life was marked by tragedy with the death of her mother at a young age. She was raised by a Christian nurse who not only cared for her but also nurtured her Christian faith. Margaret eventually devoted herself fully to God, consecrating her virginity. In the context of early Christian storytelling, virginity wasn't just about chastity. It was a bold declaration of independence from the expectations of family, society, and especially patriarchal control. It was choosing divine love over worldly ties. This would place her in a long line of female saints whose spiritual purity was seen as a form of resistance against the earthly powers. This decision enraged her father, who disowned her, leaving her to live humbly in the countryside with her nurse, tending sheep. Her beauty soon caught the attention of Olybrius, the Roman governor of the East, who proposed marriage, on the condition that Margaret renounce her Christianity. Her steadfast refusal led to, as with the other saints I already spoke of, horrific punishments and her imprisonment. This is where the story diverges into two somewhat different versions. In Western iconography, the devil himself appeared to Margaret in the form of a dragon and swallowed her whole. However, the cross she carried with her caused such agony in the dragon's belly that it was forced to spit her out, leaving her unharmed. This also sets a precedent for how she is depicted in Western art, commonly emerging from a dragon. If you've been paying attention to the video so far, this is what I meant by that recurring theme of a dragon symbolizing the devil. These confrontations are allegories for spiritual warfare. Margaret smashing the dragon or George piercing it with a lance isn't just about bravery, it's about divine power working through human vessels to overcome the devil. There's a reason why these stories were so popular in the Middle Ages. They were visual sermons, easy to understand even for the illiterate. A dragon slain by a holy figure sends a powerful message. Stay faithful, and you too can triumph over sin and darkness, even if it takes the form of a fire-breathing lizard. Meanwhile, in Eastern Orthodox traditions, the story of Margaret takes a different turn. Instead of a dragon, the devil confronted her in human form as a demon in her prison cell. Margaret, armed with unshakable faith and, apparently, a copper hammer, defeated him by smashing his skull in. Unfortunately, she still ends up losing her head later on, just like Barbara did. In some versions of the story, she was also scorched, burned, and submerged in boiling water before meeting her end. Historians, even in the Middle Ages, largely dismissed these stories as legends, and during the time of the Black Death, as one of the 14 holy helpers, she was invoked as the patron saint of women in childbirth and a protector against demonic possession or diabolical infestations, which, given both versions of her story, is rather fitting. Anyhow, that's all I have for part 1 of what might turn into a full series on the 14 holy helpers. We've covered the first 4, and if you're curious to hear more about the others, make sure to subscribe so YouTube can let you know when the next part is out. I'm really looking forward to sharing the rest of their stories with you. This is also my first long-form video on YouTube, so if you have any thoughts or feedback, constructive or otherwise, feel free to drop a comment. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next one.